At the moment, you've got really two ways that people claim this tax relief. If they are being supplied through an employment business, then it's likely that they will have a salary sacrifice in place. So they give up £1 of pay, and in return they get £1.30 of expenses that they can claim. Or they give up £1.30 for £1 of expenses is probably the better way of doing it. So there is a sacrifice. They agree to give up permanently an amount of their pay, and in return they're allowed to claim expenses, so they're better off, but there is a sacrifice. The other way that it operates through an umbrella company is that with an umbrella company they'll pay national minimum wage. You'll then be allowed to claim your travel and expenses, and then whatever's left over will be paid to the worker as a bonus on top of that. That would be a salary sacrifice arrangement under the definitions in the legislation. And then the third way is if you are a limited company contractor or a self-employed contractor, you would put it through as a business expense in respect of, that's the cost of me getting to my contract and doing the work. And that might go through in your self-assessment tax return. And it's likely that if you're a contractor within an umbrella scheme or with a contractor accountant, they'll run some software each week to basically say what you can take out of the business each week, including the travel and subsistence. So what's happening is that they are basically saying you can't salary sacrifice. It's now unlawful to salary sacrifice in respect of travel and subsistence. And you can't run the salary sacrifice arrangement. So you can't have a situation where someone's pay is made up by something connected with travel and subsistence costs. And ultimately, in most cases, the ability to recover travel and subsistence costs is removed. So no one is able to recover the cost of getting to and from work and the cost of meals whilst they're at work. Now, that's unless that there is no supervision, direction and control or the right of. So in the government's own statistics, from the 6th of April, 80% of the people who are currently eligible for travel and subsistence will no longer be eligible for travel and subsistence because of these changes. 10% will continue to be able to claim travel and subsistence because there won't be any supervision, direction and control. They will be truly self-employed. And then they think there's going to be a 10% grey area where there may be some debate about whether supervision, direction or control exists or not. The reality is if they're an employee, then there's going to be no travel and subsistence being able to be claimed. Whether they are through an umbrella, whether they're through an employment business, no travel and subsistence will be allowed. If they're operating a personal service company, a limited company or a limited company contractor, they will be able to claim travel and subsistence costs, provided on each assignment there is no supervision, direction or control, or the right of supervision, direction and control, and ultimately that it is outside of IR35. So anyone that works with contractors will be aware of IR35. IR35 is a piece of legislation that the government brought in the late 90s, which basically said that if someone acts like an employee, behaves like an employee, is treated like an employee, then for the purposes of tax, they are an employee. So it's about disguised employment. So, in the 90s, certainly within the finance industry, all of a sudden people went off payroll, and certainly in IT, lots of people suddenly went off payroll, set up their own limited companies and started doing what they'd done on the Friday, but now on a self-employed basis through their own limited company. The reason for doing that was because it was better from an accounting perspective of the end user, the company, but also it allowed the individual to take more home, so it meant that there wasn't the same wage pressure to increase wages for those highly skilled people. And the government basically said, hang on a minute, we're losing too much revenue, so they brought in IR35, which is ultimately a test. If you are a business, so if you've got the right of substitution, if you have to carry insurance, so you're taking financial risk, if you don't get the job right, can you be sued? Obviously, as a normal employee, you wouldn't be because you're doing it in the course of your employment. Do you Can you employ people? Can you send people in place of you? You know, how do you get your work? Do you advertise? Do you have your own website? In reality, are you acting as a true company and a business-to-business transaction, or are you really just a disguised employee that's chosen this route because of the tax efficiency? And it had really started, everyone had gone, you know, we've dealt with it for years, but it wasn't really that important. Everyone thought it was on its way out. But now, as a result of these changes, it's back with a vengeance ultimately, because if you've got any contractor who is saying, I want to claim travel and subsistence, they're going to have to prove that they're outside of IR35 before they're able to do that lawfully. And the government is planning to look at and change IR35 next year. And the suspicion, or the rumours, are that they'll go down the same path, so this supervision, direction or control. The various HMRC consultations that I've been to, they've been very plain and very clear that their intention is to get 90% of the population back onto payroll and back deducting taxes at source. So supervision, direction and control is not something that applies to everyone. So if you've got a contractor that comes onto your site or goes out to one of your clients, health and safety, which applies to everyone that goes on that site, won't mean that there's supervision, direction and control. It's very much about how they do the job. And I'll give you one example of a joiner or a carpenter. And the example goes along the lines of, you know, we go to an employment business and we say, we need someone to come in and help us hang some doors on this particular project. Yep, we'll send Bob in. Bob turns up on day one. He's shown the doors that he needs to hang, told where they need to go, what time the job needs to be completed by. Bob looks at the doors, takes the doors home with him to his workshop, works on the doors, brings them back, hangs them, all done. In the example, there's no supervision, direction and control because he's literally been free to use his own skill and judgment about how he's done the work. Compared to Bob turns up on day one and meets Stan, his line manager, who says, right, these are the doors I want you to do. I want you to do this door first. Here it is. This is how I want you to hang it. Stan comes back every half hour to see how things are going on. Can you take another inch off there? Can you make sure that's done? All of a sudden, something else needs to happen. Some floor needs to be laid. So Stan says, well, leave the doors alone for a few minutes and come and help the gang with the floor. And in that scenario, there would be supervision, direction and control because the manner in which he was doing his work was being supervised by someone, in that case at the end user. Now, if only all practical examples were as plain and simple as that, it would be wonderful. But I think the government's view and HMRC's view really is that if there is any doubt with regards to whether there is supervision, direction and control, you err on the side of caution and that there is supervision, direction and control and therefore travel and subsistence cost can't be allowed. Now the reality of that is that, you know, commercial pressures dictate that you don't want to pay the workers anymore. You know, you need to do it the way we've been doing it. So there may be some tension there around that, but this supervision, direction and control test is going to be a real pain if you're being put under pressure by contractors who want to be paid more. So if they're basically seeing a £2 an hour pay cut as a result of the change in legislation, if they come knocking on your door and on your end user's door of saying, right, okay, I want an extra £2 an hour, you know, unlikely to be another £2 an hour available to pay them. So in that circumstance, it's, well, can we keep the status quo? Can you keep claiming travel and subsistence? And the only way that they would be able to do that was if they could demonstrate that there was no supervision, direction and control. And it's going to be interesting because the one bit where there can be some transfer of liability, so what the government have said is that if any party provides information or documentation which misrepresents the situation, so is there supervision, direction and control? No, there's no supervision, direction and control, here it is in writing. If that is, they're using the term fraudulent, then and someone ultimately relies on that documentation to claim travel and subsistence when it wasn't available, then the liability can transfer through the chain. So it can go from recruitment agency to end user and back again. Now, I should say about all of this is typical of the government. They are The draft legislation came out in December. So this is the draft legislation we're talking about at the moment. It is expected that the final legislation will be published next week in the budget on the 16th of March. It comes into effect on the 6th of April. So we've got 2 weeks to look at it and to decide what we need to do about it. As much as I would bet on it, my wager would be that I don't think we're going to see massive changes from what we've seen before. But the one place where we might see some change is around the transfer of liability, because the government have bottled it ultimately. They did start off with a very clear intention that everyone in the supply chain had to be responsible, and they've now watered that down so that it's only in very, very rare circumstances that liability can pass through. And there's been some quite vociferous debate and pressure put on the government to ultimately say that needs to be addressed. So if there is going to be one area that might change next week when we get the final legislation, it could be around transfer of liability. But as things stand at the moment, it would be very difficult for liability to pass. It sits with either the umbrella or with the employment business ultimately.